Hello and welcome back to Diddy on Trial from the BBC World Service YouTube channel with me, Anoushka Mutanda-Dougherty. Now, it's just 7 days until opening statements in the trial of Shaun Diddy Combs. He is fighting for his freedom against federal charges of sex trafficking, transportation for prostitution and racketeering with conspiracy. He denies them all. Now, you already know we're going to be out there in New York getting you the updates as soon as they happen, so make sure you subscribe. But on the 25th of April, there was a pre-trial court hearing in the Southern District of New York, and this gave us a really clear view of how Diddy's team are gearing up to fight those sex trafficking allegations. In short, his lawyers told the court that he's a swinger and, quote, he thought it being swinging was appropriate because it was common. Also, later on, we'll be taking a look at the questions potential jurors may be being asked, including ones you might not expect, like whether they're into crime shows. Joining me today is our resident dream team, Rolling Stone's senior investigative reporter, Cheyenne Roundtree. Hi, Cheyenne.
Hi, morning.
And criminal defense attorney, Shaun Kent. Hi, Shaun.
Hey, how are you doing?
Cheyenne, can you just explain to us a little bit more about what was decided at this hearing?
Sure. So this is one of the last hearings that we'll have before, Diddy is in court. And so this hearing was to kind of hash out some last, issues on the table. One of the big things was the CNN hotel video that I think everyone has seen, where Diddy is seen kicking, dragging Cassie in a hotel as she was supposedly leaving a freak off. Diddy's team had claimed that the video was deceptive, that CNN had sped up certain aspects of the video, that there was different camera angles, that the sequence of events weren't exactly accurate. So they didn't want the video to be included at trial. However, the government said that they have a cell phone footage of the camera that shows the events similarly, but it's not the full video, and that they have witnesses that can testify to its authenticity. The judge did rule that this video will be allowed into evidence, into court. We'll just see exactly how much will be shown.
And that was one moment we've all been waiting for, to see whether the jury will be played this video. There was another sort of headline-grabbing moment where Mark Agnifilo got up and made some comments about Diddy's sexual habits, practices, proclivities. What did he say?
He basically admitted that Diddy considers himself a swinger. And I think, this whole case is boiling down to consent, or what was happening in the bedroom between, Diddy and these other alleged victims. And it seems that Diddy's defense is saying, this is a swinging lifestyle. This is his lifestyle. This is what he thought was common. It is common to bring in sex workers for these events. And what he was doing was under what he thought was normal. He's a swinger.
And Mark Agnifilo got up and said, there's a lifestyle, call it swingers or whatever you will. He thought it was appropriate because it was common. Shaun, swinging is being offered as a defense to the sex trafficking charges. Is that really a robust argument against the charges, which alleged he forced people into sexual activity?
In and of itself, no. And so that's why two things that have happened kind of make sense. It's hard to find a defense to these charges based upon what other folks are saying. So good criminal defense lawyers are trying to find either creative ways or truthful ways, and hopefully they can be both. So in this situation, by them saying that he is a swinger, he thought that this was okay. I didn't know this was basically against the law. Well, there's something specifically in the federal system called willful blindness. Willful blindness means, and the judge will tell the jury this, just because you didn't think it was against the law, or just because you turned a blind eye to crimes that were occurred, you are still just as guilty. For example, if your husband is a drug trafficker and you get all the proceeds and you're living in this multi-million-dollar home, but you never ask questions, and he doesn't go to work, and I've never seen him do drugs, but it is to be assumed, well, that's called willful blindness, and you're just as guilty of drug trafficking. So the government can argue that. The government filed notice against Diddy's team saying, you guys are trying to squeeze an expert in here, not necessarily about insanity, but about Diddy's mens rea. Mens rea is the mental status that is required to form criminal intent. So it specifically says, the government respectfully submits this memorandum of law in support of its motion to preclude the opinion testimony of Dr. Ellie Allen. The notice testimony relates to the defendant's diminished capacity to form the mens rea required to commit the charged offenses. So they're going to try to bring in an expert that says Diddy could not form the necessary mens rea, the criminal intent to know what he was doing was committing a crime. And my assumption is it is their attempt to say basically, yes, I did it, but, and even if it's a crime, I didn't know it was a crime, and I couldn't have formed the necessary mens rea to be convicted of it being a crime.
Cheyenne, we've heard testimony and through your reporting as well, you've spoken to alleged victims who say Diddy took some drugs and came out of the bathroom and he was a different person, or I didn't recognize the man that was in front of me. Shaun, could that play into this line of defense then, if we've got people taking the stand saying, actually, yeah, I didn't recognize him, he lost control, etc., etc.?
Yes and no. There is something under the law called voluntary intoxication. You cannot voluntarily take drugs yourself and say, I'm crazy, and do crazy stuff if you voluntarily induce the drugs. And so that's why I don't think they have offered anything of a true insanity defense. They're trying to do some type of public policy that if everybody is the whole, if all of your friends jumped off of a bridge, would you jump off of a bridge? I literally think that that is the defense that they're going with, that since everybody thinks swinging is acceptable, then Diddy thought it was acceptable, might even get into the fact Diddy's childhood thought that this was acceptable. So he could not form the necessary mens rea to form a criminal state of mind necessary for a conviction, because you need a criminal state of mind unless the government argues willful blindness. He knew what he was doing. He was just turning his eye to it.
Another part of what the judge decided was, okay, you can say that Diddy was a swinger or he considered himself to be a swinger, but you cannot cite examples of other prominent swingers to sort of bolster the idea that this was common. Surely then, Shaun, you're turning to the jury and you're saying, it's common, trust me. Just trust me on that. I'm not going to tell you how many other people do it in Hollywood, because that's the implication here. It's common within the circles he ran in. I'm not going to tell you that. Just take my word for it.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And what people don't, I mean, and maybe people can see it, this defense and the judge's rulings are triggering one 100% true fact. Diddy will testify. You understand? Because there's no other way to get this testimony out without him taking the stand and saying, this is a lifestyle that I have grown accustomed to, that I believe in, that I think. Because it's not like they're going to be able to put in, and I'm not going to say any celebrities' names, but people saying, this is what we all do. This would be him having to testify. I find it strange that the judge says you cannot just simply say other people do it and give specific names, but I would be remiss if those specific named people were not allowed to testify if they're on the witness list. You understand? So if a celebrity showed up and said, I was at a party with Diddy, this is what I did, this is me, I think that would be allowed, but Diddy's team is not going to be able to just randomly point the celebrity's name.
Wait a second, because they've been sort of arguing against the sensationalization of these multi-celebrity orgies and happening at these white parties and, you know, everything that social media was lit up with. Cheyenne, doesn't this line of argument just add fuel to the freak-off fire?
I think, you know, we're forgetting, I mean, not forgetting, but like this is a trial for his life. And so while in, you know, other media reports and speculative reports about, oh, who's at this party, if there's someone in the room that is a high profile name that can vouch for it, this is something we all have done. Of course, I'm sure Diddy's team was like, please come and say that what he's doing is nothing wrong, that we all do this, that this is common within our circles. And why wouldn't they add that to the defense? So versus then just kind of throwing it out there for no purpose, just for gossip and spectator sport, this is actually where this testimony would come in handy.
If they called you to the stand to say that, would you have to come, Shaun, or could you just say, I'm not putting myself out there saying that?
They could send you a subpoena. You would go through a whole thing. You would have your lawyer try to quash the subpoena. There's a lot of stuff that you go through, but the things we always say is when we're sending subpoena out, you don't want a witness who doesn't want to be there from a defense standpoint. You understand? So if you try to force somebody to get on the stand, you never know what they're going to say. So I'm sure they try to voluntarily get people and they said, heck no, because here's the problem. You put me on the stand, I'm going to hurt you more than you're going to help me. Don't you dare try to force me to get on the stand in the middle of your trial.
In terms of what went down at this pre-court hearing, those weren't the only decisions that were made. They're perhaps the headline-making ones, but there was also a plea deal that was rejected.
Kind of at the end of the hearing, one of the prosecutors stands up and makes mention of a plea deal that was offered to Diddy at some point and noted that Diddy rejected it. Now, it's the first that we're hearing that there was a plea deal on the table, but I'm sure Shaun can elaborate more of this is not so uncommon?
Not uncommon in the slightest. It does. I mean, it happens on almost every trial that I have if somebody rejects a plea offer for a couple of reasons. One, don't forget, Diddy's not doing the talking, his lawyers are doing the talking. And a lot of times what ends up happening when someone gets convicted, you don't want them later to say, I didn't know there was a deal on the table. My lawyers never told me. This is completely unfair. So this is the judge making sure you knew that there was a plea offer, Mr. Combs. You rejected the plea offer. And he asked him the questions. Have you been told the plea offer? Yes. Have you been told what the terms are? Yes. Has anyone forced you or threatened you in any way to take or not take it? No. You on your own have made the decision that you do not want this deal. Yes. And you understand this deal will never, ever be back on the table. Yes. That protects the government also in case he tries to appeal later and say, nobody told me everything. So this is incredibly common, happens in every trial. And like clockwork, usually what ends up happening is the second the defendant rejects that plea deal, the government's like, oh yeah, by the way, here's all the other evidence we plan on using against you now. Like, you turned it down? You sure? You positive? You sure? By the way, here are all the angles of this butt-naked freak-off party we intend on offering against you. And they just go from there. There's like, now that you've turned it down, we're coming after you.
Okay, given what we just spoke about at the top of the program about potentially the state of his mental well-being or ability to understand what is criminal and what isn't, how could you potentially argue that he wasn't sane enough to make those decisions, but he is sane enough to make big decisions about these procedures and what to do in regards to his freedom?
You're not wrong. And that's why I said, I don't think they're really trying to argue insanity. They're trying to argue justification, justification, and that's just impermissible. They're trying to justify it because they're not arguing he's insane. I don't believe, because you said the exact right thing, because what we always talk about is if somebody's truly insane and they commit a crime, I always say, if you're going to commit a crime and you want to prove you're crazy, get butt naked and put on a chicken suit and sit on the front yard and wait on the cops to come. But the way that he's acting as hell is showing a sane state of mind. So I really think this defense is going to justify Shaun and not to exonerate Shaun.
A lot of Shauns, can I just say, that's been a particular thing over here, making sure we're getting the right spelling of each Shaun. So those were the main points of the pre-court trial hearing. Cheyenne, there was just another conversation about a medical procedure that one of the victims may have undergone. Now, the judge didn't rule on this, but can you just fill us in on what that was all about? And Shaun, I'll come to you after that.
So there was talk about the government wanting to introduce testimony or evidence regarding to this one alleged victim that had a medical procedure that would speak to Diddy's alleged influence or control over this person's life. I believe Diddy's team, obviously they have argued against it, but, it's speaking to this idea of what's being contested as coercive control, which I believe the judge ruled that you can't call it that in court. However, it's speaking to, why would this person stay with this person that's doing all these awful things to them? And this medical procedure is speaking to supposedly the idea of how much sway and control over that he had over this one person down to their medical decisions.
What's interesting about that is you remember, and that's why I think this is fascinating if it comes in, because remember, they have said they're not going to go into any 404B evidence. I know you get tired of hearing those numbers. The 404B, the prior bad acts against other situations. They've got so much information just related to victim one and stuff about this case that it could be prior bad acts in and of itself, and they don't have to get into it. And so if they're trying to call it something different, like the coercive control, because this whole thing is about coercion. Did he coerce her into doing something? And so the government must prove that she was coerced, that this was not voluntary.
Just before we go, because we've been talking a little bit about the prospective jury questionnaires that have been filed, here are some interesting ones that I picked up from the defense and prosecution side, or ones that I just found, some of them a bit comical. One of them for the defense was, do you believe that wealthy people get away with things that less wealthy people do not? I mean, Shaun, what are they asking, the implication of that people have more access to resources and good lawyers if they're wealthy?
That is such a dumb damn question, because you're putting such a thought inside of the jury's head, because you already know what is someone going to answer to that question? No, I think rich people go through the same rules. That is such a dumb question, because the problem is you might get the answer. And then what ends up happening? Like,
wouldn't that rule everybody out? Because everybody would be like, well, that's the defense's questionnaire. So they'd be like, well, you're all obviously skewed against Diddy.
and you're actually already starting it for them. You're specifically saying Diddy is wealthy. You know, you're sending the questions like, hey, do you think this wealthy guy gets away with everything? Because if you don't, because you're already putting wealth into the jury's mind. And I don't know if that's actually necessary. So I'm not a fan of that question.
And the one from the prosecution that I thought really stuck out was, you may hear evidence that other individuals in addition to the defendant were involved in these alleged crimes. Those other individuals are not on trial here, and you may not draw any inference, favourable or unfavourable, towards the government or the defendant from that fact. You may also not speculate as to the reason why other persons are not on trial in this case. Do you have any concern that you could not follow this instruction? Well, surely that depends on who the people are, because you're going to have those questions immediately.
You are, but that actually is a great question, because that is true. Like in almost every trial, a lot of times when there's co-defendants, the co-defendant's not there. And so in unique trials, what usually ends up happening, like let's say it's a drug trial and two people are accused of selling drugs and the other person's not there, a good defense attorney is going to point well, that person must be the person who did it. And the judge has to say, look, this is Shaun Combs' day in trial. I don't want y'all to sit here and say anything about anybody else and don't think about anybody else. If there's a trial for the other people, that'll happen at another date and time, not today. So that question happens all the time, especially when there's co-defendants or not co-defendants.
So we shouldn't take from that there are going to be other celebrities taking the stand?
Not at all. The judge wants to make sure everybody understands this is Diddy's day in trial and nobody else. You'd be shocked how many times, because juries are just you, me, and otherwise. And so 12 random people sitting in a room can think what they want. Like, this is not, you could have somebody in that room saying, this is not fair. I heard that Jay-Z and Beyonce were involved in this, which makes no sense whatsoever. But that's the judge stopping that right now and say, this has nothing to do with anything you've heard, anything outside of this courtroom. You focus on Combs.
And I thought this one was quite funny. So honourable mention to this one, which is, do you watch Law and Order or CSI or other police dramas?
I've asked that question every single jury questionnaire. Every single questionnaire, I ask people, do they watch those type of legal shows?
You trying to get rid of people who think that they're like amateur detectives and stuff?
No, because if you watch certain shows, I don't know if y'all have watched Law and Order, but 90% of the times, if people watch Law and Order, there's always a conviction and the government's always right. So people who are friends of Law and Order, there's almost always a conviction at the end of the trial. And there's other shows that people watch, there's almost always a defense. So you're trying to see what people's mindsets are. If you're a big fan of Law and Order and you watch it over and over again, that means you're watching for the end potentially for a conviction. And sometimes you're like, ugh, I don't like those folks.
Cheyenne, do you watch Law and Order and CSI?
Not too much. Not too much anymore.
I wouldn't put Cheyenne, she would not get on my jury. You're off. I'm bouncing you immediately.
Thank you both so much for joining us and breaking that down today. Thank you, Shaun.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks, Cheyenne.
Bye, thank you.
So it's jury selection slated to start for the 5th of May and opening statements on the 12th of May. You know we'll be there breaking it down for you straight away. So make sure you subscribe so you never miss a thing. That's it for this episode of Diddy on Trial with me, Anoushka Mutanda-Dougherty, for the BBC World Service YouTube channel.